Hi, this is Matthew Kern, and I'm going to teach you everything you need to understand enterprise architecture in one slide deck. The IEEE and the International Standards Organization, etc., have given us a perfectly wonderful definition of architecture which we will use. And architecture is the fundamental concepts or properties of a system in its environment, embodied in its elements, relationships, and in the principles of its design and evolution. Almost anything can have an architecture. You can talk about the architecture of a house, of a computer, of a CPU in a computer, landscapes, skyscrapers. You can talk about the architecture of a software system, of a website, almost anything. Here we're talking about the architecture of an enterprise. That's why it's enterprise architecture. It didn't used to be the case that it generally fits such a definition in this way, but it's become more and more the case that enterprise architecture has been generalized and now more or less fits with the general definition of an enterprise, which is, according to Merriam-Webster, 1, a project or undertaking that is especially difficult. 3A, a unit of economic organization or activity, especially a business organization. And 3B, a systematic, purposeful activity. So which of those three definitions is it? It turns out it's all three. Enterprise architecture is commonly described as having three levels. Here's a diagram from the United States Office of Management Budget Practice Guidance from 2007. When Burke was Chief Enterprise Architect, and shows the three levels of enterprise architecture. At the top you see the enterprise level, then the segment level, then the solution level. And you can see that the enterprise level is very broad but very shallow, whereas the solution level is very narrow but very, very deep. So those correspond to the three different definitions. These three levels have also been accepted by TOGAF. TOGAF views enterprise architecture now as having three levels. Same three levels. We have the enterprise, the segment level, and the solution level, although they call that the capability level. Now for an example using DODAF. In DODAF the three levels are implicit. The solution level architecture is what you're usually drawing in terms of the architecture of a capability, and there has been a history of efforts at DoD to create a business enterprise architecture, which is the middle level corresponding to a segment. And at the very top level, at the enterprise level across DoD, there are some databases for standards and architectures at the top with a JSIDS process. So that corresponds to the enterprise level. This all grew from FIAF in 1999, FIAF version 1.1, in which you can see the enterprise architecture here. You can see segment architectures running up and down here on the side of the triangle. And you can see that this is level 3, which is the SPIWAC terminology for the level of detail. So that became clarified over time and became the three levels of enterprise architecture. So let's recap the definition in those three levels. If you look at 3A, a unit of economic organization or activity, especially a business organization, that corresponds to the enterprise level, the biggest and widest one. If you look at a systematic, purposeful activity, that's the segment level. And 1, a project or undertaking, that is the solution level, the lowest level of architecture. The first recorded use of the term enterprise architecture was in the National Institute of Standards and Technology publication, special publication 500-167, which was about controlling the costs of system integration for large, complex system integration in the federal government. Within that document, we see some initial words about describing an enterprise architecture. The diagram that was shown in the previous slide was the selected approach, and Bradford Rigdon, who ran that committee, said this panel addressed the need of architecture and standards in supporting information management throughout an enterprise. And he also said this paper takes a broader view and describes the need for an enterprise architecture that includes an emphasis on business and information requirements. And again, speaking about the scope of the architecture, said the business unit may portray either a total corporate entity, an enterprise, or a corporate subunit, which became a segment. Let's look again briefly at that architecture definition. We said that an architecture was the fundamental concepts or properties of a system in its environment as it's embodied in its elements, relationships, and the principles of its design and evolution. Hold on to that thought a moment. Again, that's elements, relationships, and principles of design. An architecture usually provides artifacts that include lists, which are lists of elements, could be lists of principles, matrices identifying relationships between those elements, drawings and documents, which may clarify elements and relationships. Now, John Zachman, often called the father of enterprise architecture, also presented in that NIST special publication we were speaking of, and here is a version of his early framework. Note that it has who, what, where, when, how, and why, and it has different perspectives. In total, there were 36 rows and 36 cells in 6 rows and 6 columns. So that is a very broad range of kinds of elements. The thing about enterprise architecture with respect to other kinds of architecture, such as computer architecture, in computer architecture we see just gates, registers, wires. In enterprise architecture we have a wider range of elements. We can have people, we can have organizations, we can have policies, we can have systems, we can have databases. All of those things can be in an enterprise architecture, and more. To clarify all this, I use something called the 5 activities model, which says that there are 5 activities in enterprise architecture. It's not particularly inventive. We saw the first 3, the enterprise level, the segment level, and the solution level architecture. And then the literature contains lots of examples of enterprise architecture related governance and enterprise architecture continuous improvement. Those 3 levels again correspond to management, and if you study management from PMI, you'll see that there's a portfolio manager, program managers, and project managers under the program managers. So those 3 levels of architecture correspond to those. That is to say that the enterprise level architect corresponds to the portfolio manager for the organization and helps make portfolio decisions. The segment level architect corresponds to the program manager, probably working for the program manager, and the solution level architect probably works for the project manager. They have 3 different jobs, they have 3 different sets of artifacts, they have 3 different scopes, 3 different purposes, and they work for 3 different people. Here we see that the 3 levels of architecture also correspond to levels of governance in the organization. You usually have a corporate board in blue. You have an investment review board in green, which the enterprise architecture corresponds to that committee, producing guidance on which decisions to make. Then you have the stage gate review board, and the segment architecture level corresponds to that, with great complexity, moving things forward to assure that the business unit actually improves. And then at the lowest level, the configuration management board can be said to correspond to the solution level architecture. These are just representative. It's not standardized, although perhaps it ought to be. Regarding the continuous improvement of enterprise architecture, each year you try an improvement to improve enterprise architecture, and each day or each week you may have a small group that gets together that attempts to improve the methods and practices and processes, and to improve process maturity. And first you write it down, and then you begin to measure it, and you predict it, and you try to proactively improve it for particular circumstances. These are levels of maturity. So that's what you're trying to do there, always making enterprise architecture better year over year. At the enterprise level, that corresponds to what's called the operating model. You talk to your typical MBA and they will speak to you of the operating model of the organization or business. The operating model has a small number of things that clarify the operation of the entire business. Now here's Spiewak's model again. Steven Spiewak, who wrote a book in 1992, Enterprise Architecture Planning. And you can see that he goes down in levels of depth and increasing levels of depth. The idea here is that the operating model is a low level of depth. It's very broad and corresponds in notion to what we mean by the enterprise level of architecture. It doesn't have to contain everything. It's very shallow, just as Burke said, but it's very broad. Here we see the segment level from the OMB Practice Guidance 2007, Burke again. And we see the different kinds of segments. Some segments provide internal services, some segments are core mission areas. And this is very important to understand, that some segments are core and some segments are supporting and some segments are just internal convenience. So there are many kinds of segments, and there are likely to be more than one segment in any organization. So there is one enterprise and multiple segments. Now at the lowest level you have solution architecture. Here's just an exploded diagram from the SR-71, which at one point I used to work on. It can be almost anything. Anything in DODAF, any sort of drawings you might have that detail the capability that you're producing, the particular product or item or tool that will allow you to do the business. The business is the line of business of the segment. In this case for the SR-71 that was strategic intelligence. And the tool, the capability, was the SR-71, the capability of obtaining strategic intelligence and zipping around high in the sky taking pictures and taking ELINT snapshots of various radar sites. So you have three different levels. You have the tool at the lowest level supporting the line of business, which is the segment. In this case, that line of business was strategic intelligence. And then at the top, you have the business itself, the United States Air Force. Here's an example for you. So why do we do enterprise architecture? Here we can see that a chain of logic as to why we do enterprise architecture. We might, at the top, identify problems to the nation, and then assign those problems to different organizations, and then the organization produces a strategy to achieve that mission which has been assigned to it, and it creates a particular program to execute that particular line of business, and then we design some particular tools to assist us, capabilities to assist us, and we allocate some portion of that perhaps to software. Now enterprise architecture started out about software. So down here we see that at the end of this, all of this chain of logic is software. Software's purpose is not just to write software, it's ultimately to achieve the solution of that national level problem that was identified up at the top. Now John Zachman has said that architecture links strategy and execution. So here is the linkage between strategy and execution, being enterprise architecture in the middle. On the left you see the strategy, on the right you see portfolio management, which is where you fund things, cause money to exist, create programs, and execute. You can't execute without money. That's about as bottom line in terms of execution as you can get. And enterprise architecture lives between these things, providing decision support as to which particular transformation strategy, which particular items we might fund in the portfolio. This is a diagram, you probably can't see much of it, of connecting the enterprise level architecture activity to portfolio management. And you can see that the inputs and outputs all go back and forth there in an organized fashion. This is in theory, it can actually be done, and it's quite workable. It's pretty straightforward. You can see it's not a very complex diagram. The idea in portfolio management is that you have a portfolio of transformation efforts, transformation initiatives. You do not have a portfolio of software systems. You do not have a portfolio of things you want to buy. You have a portfolio of things that will, initiatives that will improve the performance of the entire enterprise. You're strategic about this, and not just simply tactical. So if you have such a portfolio as directed, for instance, by the new law FITARA in the U.S. federal government, then you go down and pick the ones with the top return on investment until you run out of money, and then you stop at the red line. In practice, you probably leave some discretionary funds for the CIO so you can buy some additional things that are not controlled by portfolio management. But that's the basic idea. A portfolio of transformation efforts, and each with a cost, and you now rank them and stack them and go down the list until you run out of money. Now here you see the transition plan or roadmap, which is a concept from early enterprise architecture, back from the CF again. And in it you take these transformation efforts and you put them on a chart, like a big Gantt chart, and you show how you're achieving your goals over the years and where you'll be on each goal by which transformation efforts are completing when. Now here in this particular example, they're colored by SDLC stage, so you can see the different stages of the SDLC in different colors, and you can tell immediately on one chart everything that's happening. Here's another kind of artifact at the enterprise level, where you take the different measures from system engineering, measures of performance, measures of effectiveness, and strategic objectives, tie them to strategic goals, and you put little lines between them so you can see which one lines up with which one. It's called a line of sight diagram, and it allows you to see how your efforts at the project level feed up to meeting strategic goals and producing strategic outcomes. Emphasizing again the origins of enterprise architecture and software impact, we can see in the center there's some little bit of software. And the software lives within some system. And the system performance improves some business process performance by automating steps 3, 5, and 57. And by automating steps 3, 5, and 57 and collapsing 4 more, you create organizational improvement, organizational performance improvement, and that causes the mission to be executed more effectively. So software impact is to improve organizational performance. Software is not purchased because it's nice software, or it's cool, or it makes users happy. Software is purchased to improve organizational performance. And it turns out that such a view of tools such as software is not just restricted to software, and over time we came to realize that enterprise architecture could apply to more than software. So you can have a portfolio of all sorts of transformation efforts, changing the organization and improving the organizational performance, and some of those projects might be pieces of software as tools to improve the performance or automate some portion of business process. Some might be other kinds of tools like a bunch of cars in a motor pool, or a building, or a network. It can be almost anything. So enterprise architecture can cover almost anything, not just software. And it hasn't been just software for many years. It started moving with DODAF and mission architecture, and it slowly crept everywhere else. And it's pretty much common practice now that enterprise architecture is not thought of just in terms of software. So then the idea is that you have this portfolio of different transformation efforts which get compared against each other, and you select the best transformation efforts and fund them. So that's a continuous transformation factory. Enterprise architecture participates with portfolio management in a transformation factory, guiding the enterprise to improve its performance over time with discontinuous methods of transformation, things like benchmarking and SWOT analysis. That again can be combined with continuous methods like continuous process improvement and TQM, total quality management. So altogether, enterprise architecture contributes to this continuous transformation and to a transformation factory, creating different new transformations every year with every year's new funds to continuously improve the organization and get better and better at performing the mission. So there you go. That's the basic concept of enterprise architecture. Thank you for listening to me. If you have any questions, my contact information is on the slide.